Welcome to What Catholics Believe. I'm your host, Julius Smetona. The modern world. Is this just jargon, or is this a well-defined concept? Should we rejoice that we're living in the modern world, an age of progress and enlightenment? Or is there something sinister about the modern world? With us today to tell us what Catholics believe about the modern world is the Reverend Donald J. Sanborn, Chaplain General of Catholic Men for Christ the King. Father Sanborn, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Father Sanborn, it seems that throughout Catholic papal pronouncements, especially before Vatican II, we read about the modern world, and often it has very, very sinister overtones. What is the modern world?
The modern world is a world in which man is king. In a sentence, that's what it is. It is deeply contrasted to the Catholic world, if we may call it that, in which man is seen to be merely a part of creation, all of which, meaning all creation, proceeds toward God and has the obligation of proceeding toward God by its acts. So the modern world has this contrast, namely that God is not supreme, but man is supreme. And that is a sinister thing. The modern world was born at the time of the Renaissance and the Reformation. The spirit of the Renaissance is humanism. I'm sure even average people, by seeing television shows about the Renaissance, have heard that term, humanism. That is the acceptance of man simply as he is in himself. You hear man as man. That means man with no other consideration, no sense of obligation to something above him, but simply man as man. That is the spirit of the modern world. Now, this kernel of thought that came up in the Renaissance, the origin of which is really not well known, was translated first into the religious sphere by the Reformation, in which human beings essentially claimed for themselves the right to believe whatever they wanted about God. They took themselves away from the authority of the Catholic Church. They declared themselves independent of the authority of the Catholic Church. And that was a radical departure from the 1,000 years that preceded that point.
Well, don't people have a right to believe what they want to believe?
No, they don't, any more than they have a right to believe that 3 plus 3 is equal to 7.
This sounds very striking. It seems that you're enforcing laws on man's conscience, which seems to be free.
We are not free to disobey God. We are not free to deny reality. And God has set all of creation, the entire universe, in a certain defined nature. And in knowing those things, we must conform our minds to what is. And so we know all of the sciences about which man boasts so much, about which modern man boasts so much. Mathematics, chemistry, biology, physics, aerodynamics, space physics. All of these things are very objective. There is evidence for them, and everyone must agree on their principles. If you do not agree on the principles of these sciences, for example, you are ostracized by those communities. You are virtually excommunicated by them. Religion is the same. The religion of the world, that is, the religion that God wants the world to have, is His religion. He sent His only begotten Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, to reveal a religion to the world. And if He is God, then the human race is not free to believe whatever it wants, Rather, it is obliged to accept whatever Christ teaches.
Father, when you mention the modern world and the sinister overtones, it seems implicitly that there is something in opposition to the modern world. What is this something? What is the contrary of the...
The contrary of the modern world is the recognition of the authority of Christ and of His church. The involvement of the laws of Christ and of His church in your daily life. The submission to authority is the characteristic of the Catholic world. The modern world, on the other hand, wants to be independent of any authority, wants to see no authority, sees each individual as being an authority unto himself, and only for reasons of expediency, recognizing authority in the family and authority in government simply to iron out the daily difficulties of life. But where there is no idea of a true interior submission to law, that's characteristic of the modern world versus the Catholic world. So the political expression of this independence from Christ and from the Church that the Reformation was, the political expression of that is the French Revolution and all of the revolutions and political ideas that have come out from that. Few people realize that we live in the shadow of the 18th century and the French Revolution. Few people realize that the thinking, the political thinking that we have today comes from that time. Most people take for granted what they see as the political atmosphere of our times.
Father, perhaps we could examine several of the concrete manifestations of the modern world. For instance, and could you similarly contrast them with the Catholic notions? Something that affects everyone is work. Everyone works, everyone's trying to get ahead. Many people work 60 hours a week and sacrifice everything so they could have a higher position and more money. What's the modern world's attitude towards work? Is this the attitude? And what's the Catholic world's attitude towards work?
Well, the modern world has effectively either done away with God or enslaved him or made him subservient to man. Okay, so in any case, God in the modern world is something that is non-existent for all practical purposes. And so the end of man is seen as the enjoyment of the goods of this earth. Things, pleasures, delights, whatever fills your heart is good and should be attained to the utmost degree. And so work is the means of making money. And one of those things that the godless man delights in is money. And so work, therefore, becomes his religion, virtually. It gives him beatitude. It gives him perfect happiness because it gives him money. And that is so different and so contrasted to the Catholic mentality that it would be impossible to exaggerate the difference. The Catholic Church teaches that the purpose of the existence of man is to glorify God. Just as the mosquito must glorify God by what it does, just as the planets must glorify God by their movements, so man must glorify God. He works simply to sustain himself in what is necessary for him to achieve his ultimate goal, which is the glory of God, which is his own eternal salvation. St. Thomas Aquinas is very clear about these things, that the only purpose of material goods is to give us what is necessary in order to achieve our ultimate end, which is happiness with God. And therefore, work takes a very secondary place in the Catholic view.
Should work be more important than one's family?
No, work exists for the family. As a matter of fact, I would go so far as to say that if a man were independently wealthy, that he should stay home. His primary function in life is not to make money and enrich his estate. His primary function in life is to save his own soul primarily, and also to form his family, his wife, his children. That's the reason why he goes out to work, so that his children can eat and his wife can eat and wear clothes and have a house, have necessities. But it is not to simply amass money and to buy things and multiply gadgets around the house. Mm-hmm. No, the work exists for the family and not family for work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In our modern world, we've seen the emergence of several new species. One of these species is the yuppie, the young, upwardly mobile professional, and another creature is the dink, double income, no kids, where the husband and wife work, don't have children, and do everything they can to enjoy the power and prestige that comes from an exciting and exhilarating career. How does the Catholic world look in these two creatures?
With pity and misery. That these are people who do not know why they exist. Mm-hmm. I was once stationed in California where there is a great deal of double income. Mm-hmm. The houses are so expensive out there that people practically must have double incomes in order to afford them. And I saw in the morning people dropping off children in daycare centers which seemed to be at every corner. And my heart went out to these children. Why do they exist? Why were they brought into the world? To be dropped off at daycare centers? Mm-hmm. To be raised by strangers, not knowing their parents except in the hours of the evening when they might get an hour or two with them? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not why men were created. Mm-hmm. This is not why they exist. Mm-hmm. And if there is the multiplication of drugs like cocaine and all of the other things, and the spreading of alcoholism, mm-hmm. and the spreading of promiscuity and divorce, adultery, all of these things, it is because people are not finding happiness in this amassing of goods. Mm-hmm. It simply cannot fill up the heart of man. Mm-hmm. And the more they amass them, the more they find out that there is simply not enough there. They go from husband to husband or wife to wife, divorce to divorce, from pleasure to pleasure, and they still cannot find it.
Father, one teaching which has been very, very much rejected by the modern world, if we may use that term, and has certainly even been very controversial among Catholics, is birth control. The opposition to the Catholic Church on birth control. Why is this so typical of the modern world, and why does the Church insist upon no artificial contraception?
It's typical of the modern world because the God of the modern world is human convenience. And having more than 2 children is inconvenient. There's things like diapers and noise and other problems to consider. It's inconvenient for people. And therefore, they should not have to, in the modern thinking, should not have to put up with such inconveniences. And for them, the thwarting of the natural processes of generation is a completely moral thing. They say, all of this exists for us. It exists for our convenience. So if we want to stop a child being conceived, we have the right to do that. Mm-hmm. The Catholic Church comes from exactly the opposite angle, mm-hmm. and says the processes of generation are a participation in God's very own creative process. You are raised up to be an instrument of God in the creation of a human being. Therefore, you cannot possibly fool around with these processes. That's something intrinsically wrong. St. Thomas Aquinas says it's akin to murder, birth control. it's very similar to abortion. It's simply abortion a little bit down the line or a little bit further away from the child. It's the same thing.
Why does the, well actually, why? Off in the 1950s and even in the early 60s, one often identified a Catholic family by the fact that it was a large family with many children. Why does the Church seem to encourage many children in a family?
The Church encourages the natural use of marriage. Not only encourages it, teaches it. That you must act according to nature in marriage. And if both husband and wife are able to have children, the natural course of a marriage is many children. And that's why Catholics always had many children. It is a beautiful thing. If, to compare it to an example, if a tree in your backyard, say an apple tree, bears a lot of fruit, you don't say, oh, look at all the fruit we have this year, isn't that terrible? You're happy that the tree has borne a lot of fruit. And so if your marriage has borne a lot of fruit, that is, that more children have been brought into the world ultimately to glorify God, that there is more glory for God, because these children have the possibility of going to heaven and standing with the angels and the saints, glorifying God. That's a source of happiness. We should be happy that there is new life in the multiplication of human beings, not sad. But if we are coming from the idea that the only thing that counts is me and my convenience, then of course another child is considered a horror. As we hear women speak about in offices and supermarkets, they talk about another child as if it was having terminal cancer. I mean, it's disgusting, frankly. To
move from the realm of the family to another social realm, ours seems to be an age of revolution. There's revolution in Central America, and often it's, I could use a stronger term, Marxist or communist revolution. We see that communism is increasingly moving towards Lenin's prophetic pronouncement that they will encircle the last bastion of capitalism and it'll fall into their overripe hands like an overripe fruit. And the closer they get to this goal, the more blasé the American public seems to be. They have no concern about this today. How does communism stand vis-a-vis the modern world?
Communism is the natural outgrowth of the modern world, and the popes have said it. For this reason, that once you make man the king of everything, once his convenience, his interests are at the top of all morality, once all creation and even God himself is seen to exist for man, then what is most important is the collective mind of man. So the state then becomes man's greatest act, his greatest institution. The collective man is greater than the individual. And it takes a few logical steps to come to communism then. The complete collectivization of all society, where the individual becomes simply a utensil of the state. And there are millions, if not billions, of people living in that very concept that I just described today, even now as we speak. They are living as utensils of a huge state. There has been no greater slave society on earth than the Soviet Union. I mean, even when you consider the ratio of slaves in the Greek world and the Roman world, which was very high, over 1/2, considered with regard to the free men. The Soviet Union and Communist China run slave states that the world has never ever before seen. And this modern world is what generates it. Conversely, when the church, which is the true Church of Christ, the Roman Catholic Church, when it is enthroned properly in its place as the representative of God on earth, then it places everything in order. Then the state has an obligation to God through the church. And the state is naturally limited, is not seen as the ultimate goal, the ultimate institution of man, but rather is seen in its own limited place and purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And the individual is given a much greater dignity because he sees that the state and the church actually exist for him in order that he get to God.
Mm-hmm.
That is that's the formula for a perfect society right there.
Father, often one can perhaps best get to know a society through its artistic output, because through its art it seems that man's philosophical ideas, his aspirations, achieve a certain concrete form. Certainly in the last 150 years there was a very great break in art and painting, in music, even perhaps in literature. What is the art of the modern world? Does it embody the spirit of the modern world, and how are its principles contrasted by Catholic notion of art?
The art of the modern world is sick. That's the only way that I could describe it. It's sick. If you go to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, or if you look at any piece of modern art, it is a complete refusal of reality. No matter what subject it should treat, no matter what title it should have, it is a refusal of reality. It is, in many cases, downright ugly, which is, again, typical of the modern world, because modern man does not even want to see the natural principles govern him. He wants to be free to reject everything, even the natural principles of beauty and goodness. And so he cultivates these ugly things. You go to Chicago or New York, and you see pieces of trash in front of office buildings that were paid for by, I'm sure, hundreds of thousands of dollars of, and at times, public money. These ugly pieces of trash that have enriched some artist. And they are sickening. I mean, just the average person must find them revolting. Mm-hmm. I even saw an article recently in the newspaper that people are starting to complain about these things, that they're so ugly. Or you have the atonal music of Schoenberg and Stravinsky and Bartók, a refusal of the order and harmony given to us by God, of the very traditional 8 tones that come to us from the ancient world, the Greeks, and upon which all music has been based. The modern world wants no restraints. It wants to be free to be perverse. Mm-hmm. And we see now even the most horrifying sexual perversions being blessed by the modern world. Mm-hmm. If you want to go and be sexually perverse, go ahead. You have the freedom to do that. Mm-hmm. That is the modern world in action.
Another, I think, manifestation, interesting manifestation, is the following. It seems that the 20th century is the first that actually institutionalized such a thing as popular culture. And we have, popular art, popular music, and most recently, in the last 30 years, 40 years, so-called rock music. How is this indeed an embodiment of the spirit of the modern world, and how would the Catholic man look on these things?
Rock music comes from the jungle beatings. I mean, it's to me, it's a sign of the de-evolution, if anything, of the human being. It appeals solely to the sensitive, that is, rather the sensual nature of man. It is completely devoid of melody and has an entrancing beat to it. The purpose of it is to get young people, or whoever listen to it, into gyrations. I mean, what you see like natives in remote parts of the world doing. It is it represents the complete degeneration of the human being. When we consider what human beings can descend to, when we consider the way some of the peoples in the remote parts of the world, like Borneo and whatnot, what the human race is capable of descending to, it is really shocking. And this rock music is representative of this descent into the basest forms of existence. But it's typical of the modern world, which refuses reality. It turns simply on itself. It refuses the truth and the intellectual order. It wants only its pleasures and delights. That automatically draws it into becoming animalistic and base, primitive.
What does the modern world ultimately lead to? The principles of the modern world, where are they leading us?
The principles of the modern world ultimately lead to the Antichrist, because they proceed from Satan, who is the original perversion, the original perverter. He is intrinsically perverted because he is an angel that rejects God. And Satan, at the bottom of all this, will eventually lead this to a man who embodies all these satanic principles of rebellion against God, which is the spirit of the modern world.
So the spirit of the modern world, in a sense, is the spirit of revolution.
Absolutely. It is the spirit of independence from God and hatred of God.